Welcome back to Moby-Dick. This is Chapter 1, Loomings, or Loamings. When we start out with this chapter, we're going to go through some of the definitions of the words, and then we're going to review how this fits in with extracts and what we think this is going to, what kind of information this is going to give us to prepare us for reading this story. Chapter 1 is the first time we meet our narrator, and he introduces himself, "Call me Ishmael," which is a loaded sentence in and of itself. Ishmael, of course, is the oldest son of Abraham, not Isaac, but Ishmael. And there's a reason why you would call him Ishmael. Ishmael is known to be a wanderer, but he's also an illegitimate son. So although he was firstborn, he was not the ancestor of the chosen people of God. That son is Isaac. And we might want to keep that in mind. Right now we're still collecting information about who is talking to us and what they might be talking about. We don't yet know enough about our story to figure out how all of this information is going to fit in together. But anytime an author goes to this kind of trouble to set a stage and to set a character, anytime an author gives us this many clues about what he's talking about, we need to keep track of them. It's probably going to be important. In fact, one of the distinctions between literature and pulp fiction is the use of detail. Lots of writers can spew words onto a page and write very long works, even very descriptive passages, and yet it doesn't have any meaning other than what it obviously is on the page. And you can tell because once you start to scratch the surface, you find that there's nothing underneath the surface. An author who spends the kind of time and attention to create sentences that are packed with multiple meaning starts to approach what I define as literature. It is a work that tries to talk about more than one thing at a time, and it tries to talk about it in a way that it encompasses all of the meaning at once. We don't do this very well with language. Language has a hard time meaning more than one thing at a time. And as we talk to each other, we tend to get very frustrated with meaning that isn't clear. And yet, in our lives, meaning usually isn't clear. Things often don't mean only one thing at a time, and even our very clear feelings about one subject or a person or a place or a thing, well, we usually don't feel just one way about them. There is often tension in what we feel and think, and there is often conflict. And therefore, it makes sense that a book that tries to talk about civilization and tries to talk about madness needs, by its very nature, it needs to contain the kind of tension and ambivalence and conflict in its very descriptions and in its very characters in order to have any shot at authenticity. If we're not going to have a book that is bombastic and preachy, it needs to be just as confused and therefore confusing as the subject it's trying to discuss. So rather than getting frustrated with Moby-Dick at how difficult it is to read sometimes, let's give it some credit for being a challenge. If it were easy, it wouldn't be an epic hunt for a white whale. We should have to work just as hard as they do, if it's going to mean anything at all. So let's start out by going through Ishmael. And there's a huge difference in how this chapter sounds when you read it to yourself as opposed to when you read it out loud. Read on the page, it's challenging. There's a great deal of complexity to the sentence structure, and there's a lot of vocabulary that we don't use anymore. There are many references to things, not to mention incorrect references. And in the 21st century, it sounds very complicated. In terms of action, in chapter 1, what we have is Ishmael introducing himself. Hi, I'm Ishmael. And he says, I was broke and I was grumpy and discontented, so I decided to go to sea. I like to go to sea when I'm in a bad mood because, I like the sea. Generally speaking, I like to work. I don't want to be a passenger because, you have to pay someone else to take you around the world if you're a passenger. Whereas if you're working on the ship, they pay you. So you get to go to sea and you get paid. It's awesome. This time, for a change of pace, I decided to go on a whaling ship. So, I went on a whaling ship. And that's what I did. Okay, that's what happens in chapter 1, okay? We meet this guy. He explains why he goes to sea. He explains that he was broke and grumpy when he went to sea. And for a change of pace, he went on a whaling ship instead of a regular merchant vessel. That's your action. That isn't nearly all that goes on here. So let's take a few minutes to go through what goes on. In the beginning of this story, Ishmael can't decide if he wants to tell us a great epic adventure that has, metaphorical importance to society at large. Is he Odysseus, for example? Or is he just spinning an old sea yarn? And, are we sitting around a fire drinking a beer or, tea, because we're proper people, and just listening to one guy tell a story to pass a winter's evening? I don't think Ishmael knows what kind of story he wants to tell us. Sometimes he sets out very grand descriptions, and then he backs away from it. So the first paragraph of this chapter, you can hear the tension in it right away. He starts out, call me Ishmael, obviously, but then some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little, and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen, and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses, and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. Okay, despite the really complicated sentences, he's actually being funny. It's okay to laugh at Moby-Dick. In fact, I recommend that you do. Ishmael is funny. There's even a fart joke in chapter 1, believe it or not. So despite any pretensions to high literature, it's still funny. It's kind of like Shakespeare that way. A website that will help with understanding the vocabulary is called powermobydick.com. It's an annotated copy of the text. And by that, what they do is they highlight the different references or vocabulary, and they just give you the definitions. They don't tell you what to think, but I recommend that you pull it up because it will clarify words we don't use anymore, or references that we might not have in our pop culture anymore. It doesn't tell you when he's wrong. And I just want to point out a couple of these. There is a point on... Let me find the page. It's page 3 in the original text. Ishmael says... He's describing how really everyone who's honest with himself will acknowledge that at some point or another we all want to go to sea. And he says, why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a robust, healthy soul in him at some time or other crazy to go to sea? Why, upon your first voyage as a passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity, and own brother of Jove. Of course, Jove is a Roman god, not the Greek one. Surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. Okay, let's spend a couple of minutes on these sentences here. Obviously, the story of Narcissus, he's so in love with himself, he thinks he's so beautiful, that he spends all of his time looking into the water at his reflection and admiring himself. He falls in love with his reflection, and in trying to reach out and touch his reflection, touch his beloved, he falls into the lake and drowns. Okay, so his self-love and complete obsession with himself is what kills him. It's not that he saw a tormented, mild image in a fountain. That's wrong. He didn't. He fell in love with himself. But suppose for a moment that Ishmael is right. We see ourselves as a tormented and mild image in manufactured bodies of water, not natural lakes, but fountains that are built by other tormented and mild images. And we look into these diluted reflections and drown. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. Now, pretty soon, Ishmael is going to back away from this kind of strong statement about the metaphysical meaning of life. And he's going to go back to making jokes about where he is and what things look like and people who go to sea. But he spent a lot of time, before introducing himself even, setting the stage, trying to explain to us the significance of the whale in our mind. And here, he's trying to describe the relationship of man to the sea. We are driven to the sea. We are driven to the place where the wild thing lives. To get away from the ungraspable phantom of life and try to get closer to life itself. This is the key to it all. We ready to go forward? I think we are. I think we're as ready as we're ever going to be. So let's move on. Chapter 2 is next.
Good morning and welcome back to Moby-Dick. Before we move on to Chapter 2, I want to wrap up a little bit of Chapter 1. I meant to point out a couple of passages before closing out Loomings, and I didn't. So I'm going to go back and do that now. At the very least, I think it's beautiful, which is good enough reason in itself, but it might also be helpful in reading the book later. On page 6, Ishmael is talking about how it's not always comfortable at first to accept being ordered around as a sailor, but you get used to it. He says that even this wears off in time, and he goes on. What of it? If some old hunks of a sea captain orders me to get a broom and sweep down the decks, what does that indignity amount to? Weighted, I mean, in the scales of the New Testament. Do you think the Archangel Gabriel thinks anything the less of me because I promptly and respectfully obey that old hunks in that particular instance? Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. Well then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right, that everybody else is one way or other served in much the same way, either in a metaphysical or a physical point of view, that is, and so the universal thump is passed round, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades, and be content. Okay, I actually read that wrong. It's actually either in a physical or metaphysical point of view. Sorry. I'm not properly caffeinated yet this morning. But I think that's really beautiful. The line, "Who ain't a slave? Tell me that," which is a beautiful transition from what we read so far. It's short. The words are short. It's simple. It's clear. Everything else has been very long-winded and, full of allusions and fancy words. And this is just straightforward. Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. And the universal thump is passed around, and everyone else is one way or the other served in much the same way. And all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. The next paragraph down, there's a wonderful little commentary on the difference between being paid and being paid for your work and paying someone else to do work for you. And it's really funny. You should read it. Okay. And then let's see here. Towards the end of the chapter, he goes back and he says, I cannot tell exactly why I went on this whaling voyage. Other people in the world, they do these big fancy things, and me, I went on this small thing, this small sailing adventure. But it happened, and, with other men, perhaps such things would not have been inducements, such things being the danger and the uncertainty of coming home. But as for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror, and could still be social with it, would they let me, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. So, I guess we should remember that we all get thumped around by fate and by life, and we should try to be on friendly terms with it. Let's move on to chapter 2.